She said it like she was asking me to pass the salt. "It's just one night," she said, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, already half turned away. "I need some space. I'll be back in the morning." Not angry, not nervous, calm, almost bored. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because my body did something before my brain caught up. I nodded the way you do when someone explains a delay at the airport or tells you it might rain later. Automatic, empty. She waited for a question. I could feel it. "Where are you going? With who? Why now?" Her eyes flicked back to me for half a second, like she was checking if I'd play my part. I didn't. "Okay," I said. That was it. One word, no edge, no suspicion, no fight. Something shifted in her face. Not guilt, disappointment, like she'd rehearsed a conversation and I skipped my lines. She said it like she was asking me to pass the salt. "It's just one night," she said, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, already half turned away. "I need some space. I'll be back in the morning." Not angry, not nervous, calm, almost bored. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because my body did something before my brain caught up. I nodded the way you do when someone explains a delay at the airport or tells you it might rain later. Automatic, empty. She waited for a question. I could feel it. "Where are you going? With who? Why now?" Her eyes flicked back to me for half a second, like she was checking if I'd play my part. I didn't. "Okay," I said. That was it. One word. No edge, no suspicion, no fight. Something shifted in her face. Not guilt, disappointment, like she'd rehearsed a conversation and I skipped my lines. She shrugged, picked up her overnight bag from the chair, the small one, not the suitcase, and walked past me. I smelled her perfume as she passed, not the one she wore every day, the other one, the one she said was too strong for work. The door closed softly behind her. I stood there for a long time after the sound faded, longer than I'm comfortable admitting, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock in the hallway. All the small noises you never notice until you're alone in a house that still thinks it's married. We'd been together 12 years, married for 8. No dramatic fights, no flying plates, just erosion. Tiny daily withdrawals I told myself were normal. She worked late more often. I traveled less but felt further away. Conversations turned into logistics. Who's picking up groceries? Who forgot to pay the internet bill? And then the word space appeared. Space is a polite word. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't explain. It makes you feel unreasonable for asking questions, like you're crowding someone by wanting clarity. I went into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her side was already neat, pillow fluffed, phone charger missing. Prepared. That hurt more than I expected. I opened the closet. Her clothes were still there, all of them. Dresses, coats, shoes lined up by color. She hadn't left. She'd just stepped out. That's when it hit me. Not like a punch, but like cold water. She wasn't risking anything tonight. Not the house, not the marriage, not me. She assumed I'd still be here in the morning, exactly where she left me, waiting. I stood up and walked into the living room. The place looked the same as it had an hour ago. Couch, blanket folded, mail on the table. Our wedding photo on the shelf. Us laughing, sunburned, holding plastic cups at a beach wedding we said would be low pressure. I picked up the frame and turned it face down. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought there would be a moment like in movies, knees buckling, hands shaking, dramatic realization. Instead, there was clarity, quiet and sharp. I went to the spare room and pulled out my old duffel bag, the one I used before we got married. Still smelled faintly like dust and aftershave. I packed slowly. Not everything, just what I needed. Clothes, laptop, documents, the watch my father gave me. I left the rest, not out of generosity, out of certainty. This wasn't a break, this was a decision. Hers first, mine second. Around midnight, I placed my keys on the kitchen table. Not hidden, not dramatic, just there, next to the mail she hadn't opened. I looked around once more, not to say goodbye, but to make sure I wasn't acting out of impulse. I wasn't. When I closed the door behind me, it clicked louder than it ever had before. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like something I had to fix. I didn't go far that night, just far enough that turning back would feel stupid. I drove until the city thinned out and the streetlights grew farther apart, then pulled into a motel I'd passed 100 times and never noticed. The sign buzzed like it was tired of existing. Vacancy. I paid cash without being asked why, which felt like a kindness. The room smelled like detergent and something older underneath it. I dropped the bag by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, staring at the wall. This was supposed to be the part where I spiraled, where doubt rushed in and told me I was overreacting, that 12 years deserved more than one quiet exit. Instead, my phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. A minute later, another message, then another. I didn't read them, not yet. I wasn't strong enough to see her version of the night while mine was still forming. I lay back and stared at the ceiling fan, counting the rotations until sleep came in fragments, dreams without images, just pressure. I woke before dawn. The room was gray and still. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then memory settled in, calm and heavy. I checked the time, 6:12 a.m. That's when I read the messages. First one, "Are you okay? You didn't say much last night." Second, "I'm heading back soon." Third, "Why aren't you answering?" No apology, no explanation, just mild confusion that the furniture had moved. I didn't reply. I showered, dressed, and checked out before the front desk was fully awake. Outside, the air was cold enough to wake me the rest of the way up. I sat in the car and thought about what she'd walk into. The quiet, the keys, the absence that couldn't be talked out of. I imagined her standing in the kitchen, bag still on her shoulder, scanning the room like something might be hiding. I wondered if she'd feel panic or irritation first. By the time I reached my brother's place, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Calls now, voicemails. The shift had happened. Silence had become unacceptable. He didn't ask many questions, just opened the door, took in my face, and said, "You can take the couch." I slept there for a few hours, the kind of sleep that feels earned. When I woke, the messages had changed tone. "I don't understand what you're doing. This isn't funny. Please call me." I finally listened to the voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled, like she was holding something back. Not guilt, fear of losing control of the narrative. "I came home and you're not here," she said. "Where are you?" I didn't call back. Instead, I went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet. Kids still inside, parents late for work, life continuing without consulting me. Around noon, a new message came in. "Can we talk about this like adults?" That one made me stop walking. Like adults, as if adults disappear for the night and return refreshed, expecting everything to reset. I sat on a bench and typed, then deleted, then typed again. Eventually, I sent one sentence. "I gave you the space you asked for." No accusations, no explanations, just truth. Her reply came fast. "This isn't what I meant." Of course it wasn't. I turned off the phone after that, not out of cruelty, but preservation. I knew if I kept reading, I'd start negotiating against myself, start shrinking my boundaries to make her comfortable again. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not to file anything yet, just to understand. Knowledge is a kind of anchor. He spoke calmly, methodically, like my life was a spreadsheet. I appreciated that more than sympathy. That evening, my brother ordered takeout and didn't try to fill the silence. We ate and watched something mindless. I laughed once, surprised by the sound of it. Late that night, I turned my phone back on. One new message. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." I stared at it for a long time. Neither did I, once. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of balance, like something heavy had finally settled where it belonged. Not relief exactly, more like my body had stopped bracing for impact. I lay there on my brother's couch, listening to the normal sounds of someone else's life beginning. The coffee grinder, the shower running, a radio murmuring in another room. I realized how long it had been since mornings felt neutral. Hours had always carried tension, unspoken reviews of the night before, small corrections disguised as jokes. My phone stayed quiet for almost an hour. That worried me more than the messages. Silence, when it comes from someone who usually controls the flow, means recalculation. Then it rang. I didn't answer. I watched it vibrate itself still, then placed it face down on the table. When I picked it up later, there was an email. Subject line, "Please." She'd never emailed me before, unless it was a receipt or a link. Seeing emotion compressed into a subject line felt desperate in a way that texts never quite do. I didn't open it right away. I went outside instead, sat on the steps, let the sun hit my face. I needed to know who I was before I let her explain who she thought I was. When I finally read it, it was longer than I expected. Careful, structured. She explained that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that nothing had been planned the way it looked, that she'd been feeling disconnected for a long time and didn't know how to say it without starting a fight. She wrote that leaving for one night wasn't the same as leaving a marriage, that I'd misunderstood. There it was, the word that always appears when accountability gets uncomfortable. Misunderstood. She asked where I was staying. She asked if I was safe. She asked if we could meet and talk, just the two of us. No accusations, no ultimatums. I noticed what wasn't there. No denial. No, nothing happened. Just framing. Soft edges around a hard shape. I replied once, I didn't misunderstand. I just finally listened. After that, I stopped engaging. I told my job I needed a few personal days. I forwarded important documents to a private drive. I changed passwords I hadn't thought about in years. Each small task felt grounding, like building a floor under my feet. On the third day, she showed up at my brother's door. I hadn't told her where I was. That was the point. When I opened the door and saw her standing there, hair pulled back, eyes red but focused, I felt something unexpected. Distance. Not anger, not longing. Distance, like seeing a place you used to live on the news. I just want to talk, she said. My brother disappeared into the other room without a word. We stood there for a moment, both waiting for the other to break the silence. I realized she was waiting for permission. 5 minutes, I said. Here. She nodded quickly, grateful, already adjusting. She started talking right away about stress, about feeling invisible, about how that night wasn't about someone else. It was about her needing to feel like herself again. She kept using the word space. When she finally paused, I asked one question. Did you expect me to still be there in the morning? She hesitated just long enough. Yes, she said. Of course. That answer did something final inside me. I wasn't, I said. That's the difference. She looked at me like I'd changed languages. I didn't leave to punish you, I continued. I left because I understood what staying would mean. It would mean teaching myself to accept less, quietly. She tried to reach for my arm. I stepped back. Not dramatically, just enough. The 5 minutes ended without a timer. She asked if I was filing for divorce. I said I was thinking clearly for the first time in a long while. That scares me, she said. I know, I answered. When she left, I closed the door gently. No slamming, no speeches. I leaned my forehead against the wood for a second, then straightened up. Later that night, lying on the couch again, I realized something simple and unsettling. She hadn't expected me to disappear. She'd expected me to wait. A week passed before anything official happened. And in that space between decisions and consequences, life felt oddly quiet. Not empty quiet, like a room after a storm where nothing is broken but everything is shifted. I stayed at my brother's place, then moved into a short-term rental closer to work. I didn't want comfort. I wanted neutrality. A place that didn't know me as a husband. She kept reaching out, but less frequently now. The messages lost their urgency and gained polish, as if she were editing herself before sending. I could tell she was trying to regain balance, trying to stand somewhere that didn't feel like sinking sand. I didn't respond. Silence wasn't a tactic anymore. It was a boundary. One afternoon, I returned to the house to collect the rest of my things. I timed it carefully. She wouldn't be home. I walked through rooms that still smelled faintly like us, and it struck me how little of myself I actually needed to take. Most of what we accumulate together isn't shared identity, it's shared storage. I packed what remained without ceremony. No notes, no symbolic gestures. On the way out, I stopped in the kitchen. The keys were gone from the cable. She'd moved them. That detail stayed with me longer than it should have. 2 days later, I filed. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt aligned, like my actions finally matched something I'd known but avoided naming. She called that night. I answered this time. Her voice was steadier than before, controlled. She said she couldn't believe I was really doing this, that one night had ended everything. She said people work through worse. They do, I said, when both people are still in the room. She went quiet. Then she asked the question she'd been circling for days. Was there someone else? She asked. No, I said. That's why I left. I don't know if she understood that. Maybe someday she will. The divorce wasn't dramatic. No public scenes, no long emails, just paperwork and logistics and the slow, irreversible movement of a life redirecting itself. Friends reacted in predictable ways. Some were shocked. Some said nothing. A few admitted they'd wondered how long I'd keep bending. Months passed. I rented a small apartment with too much light and not enough furniture. I learned how quiet evenings could feel without being lonely. I cooked for myself. I slept deeply. I stopped flinching at notifications. One evening, while unpacking a box I'd ignored for weeks, I found an old card she'd written early in our marriage. Talked about forever, about choosing each other daily. I read it once, then put it back in the box and taped it shut. Not everything needs closure. Some things just need distance. The last time we spoke was brief. She asked if I ever thought about coming back. I told her I thought about the version of myself I'd almost lost. She said she wished she'd known how serious I was. I was always serious, I said. I just stopped explaining myself. After the call ended, I sat by the window and watched the city move. People passing, cars stopping, lights changing. Ordinary, unstoppable motion. She had asked for one night. I gave her a morning without me. Looking back now, I can see the signs I chose to ignore. It wasn't just that night. That night was simply the moment the pattern became undeniable. For months before, maybe longer, there had been a gradual distancing I convinced myself was normal. Marriage ebbs and flows, I told myself. People get busy, life gets complicated. But busy and distant aren't the same thing. She had stopped asking about my day in any meaningful way. Our conversations had become transactional exchanges of information. Don't forget the dry cleaning. Your mother called. I'll be home late. Each sentence a brick in a wall I pretended wasn't being built. I'd respond with matching efficiency, thinking I was being respectful of her time, her stress, her needs. What I was really doing was making myself smaller, taking up less space so she'd have more room to breathe. I thought that's what love looked like: accommodation, flexibility, understanding. But somewhere along the way, accommodation became invisibility. I wasn't being considerate, I was disappearing. The night she asked for space, I recognized something in her tone I'd heard before. It was the same voice she used when returning a sweater that didn't fit. Polite, matter-of-fact, already mentally moved on. No anger, because anger requires investment. This was cooler than that. This was someone who'd already made a decision and was just completing the necessary steps. I think part of me knew, even as I nodded, that this wasn't about one night. It was about testing boundaries, seeing how much I'd tolerate, checking if I'd still be there when she returned, like furniture that doesn't complain when you rearrange it. And historically, I would have been. I would have swallowed my questions, accepted her explanation, and reset to our normal pattern of polite distance. But something shifted in that moment of watching her leave. Maybe it was the perfume, the one saved for special occasions. Maybe it was the packed bag, prepared before the conversation. Maybe it was just that I'd finally accumulated enough tiny dismissals to reach some invisible threshold. Whatever it was, clarity arrived without fanfare. I suddenly saw our entire relationship from a different angle, like walking around a sculpture I'd only ever viewed from one side. The years of waiting became suddenly visible, waiting for her to come home, waiting for conversations to deepen, waiting for her to notice I was fading, waiting for things to get better without ever naming what was wrong. I'd been waiting so long I'd forgotten what I was waiting for. Or maybe I'd known all along and just didn't want to admit it. I was waiting for her to choose me with the same certainty I'd chosen her. That certainty had died slowly, starved by 1,000 small moments of being treated as optional. The dinner reservations she canceled last minute, the weekend plans that somehow never materialized, the way her eyes would glaze over when I spoke about something that mattered to me. Each instance was defensible on its own. Life happens. People get tired. Stress is real. But together they told a story I'd been refusing to read. Leaving that night wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of every time I'd swallowed my hurt, rationalized her behavior, and chosen to believe things would change. I'd been giving her the benefit of the doubt for so long I'd run out of doubt to give. What remained was just clarity, sharp and unforgiving. In the motel room, staring at the ceiling, I realized I wasn't angry. Anger would have meant surprise, and I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes. Sad, certainly, but not surprised. Some part of me had been expecting this, or something like it, for longer than I wanted to admit. The only surprise was my own response. I'd always assumed that if this moment came, I'd fight, I'd plead, I'd try to win her back. Instead, I felt relief. Relief is a strange emotion to feel when your marriage ends. It seems wrong, almost cruel, but it was there, undeniable. Relief that I no longer had to pretend everything was fine. Relief that I no longer had to manage her moods or walk on eggshells or wonder what I'd done wrong this time. Relief that I could finally stop performing the role of the understanding husband who asks for nothing. The messages on my phone, her confusion, her demands for answers, only reinforced what I already knew. She'd expected me to absorb this, like I'd absorbed everything else. My absence wasn't supposed to be possible. It violated an unspoken agreement I'd never actually agreed to. My brother understood without explanation. That's the benefit of people who've known you your whole life. They can see when you've changed, and they know enough not to push. He gave me space, real space, not the coded kind that means I need to do whatever I want while you wait. He gave me a place to land and the dignity of silence. Those first few days at his place, I felt like I was learning to breathe differently. Deeper, slower, without the constant tension in my chest I'd stopped noticing until it was gone. I slept better than I had in months. No middle-of-the-night anxiety, no waking up already preparing for disappointment. Just sleep, clean and complete. Her escalating messages became almost predictable. First confusion, then frustration, then attempts at negotiation. We can work through this. Don't throw away 12 years. You're being dramatic. Each one trying to reframe my decision as an overreaction to her reasonable need for space. But I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting, finally, from a place of clarity rather than accommodation. When I turned off my phone that first full day, it felt like setting down weight I'd been carrying so long my muscles had forgotten what relaxed felt like. I didn't need to see her justifications, her explanations, her carefully worded attempts to make me doubt my own perception. I knew what I knew. She'd left expecting to return to the status quo. I'd left creating a new one. The lawyer's office was unremarkable, which somehow made it easier. Fluorescent lights, generic art, a desk with organized files. He asked straightforward questions and took notes without judgment. What's the situation? How long married? Any children? Assets? I answered mechanically, facts without emotion, and felt grateful for the lack of drama.
This was business, and treating it as such felt respectful to both of us, me and the person I was becoming. Calling him wasn't about revenge or making a point, it was about information. I needed to understand my options, my rights, what the path forward actually looked like. Knowledge is power, but more than that, it's grounding. It takes the formless anxiety of what now and gives it structure, steps, process, things that can be done rather than just endured. That night, eating takeout with my brother, I felt more present than I had in years. We didn't talk about her or the marriage or what came next. We just existed in the same space. Two people sharing food and mindless television. Normal, unremarkable, exactly what I needed.
Her email arrived like a carefully constructed argument, the kind you write and rewrite, testing different approaches until you land on the one that sounds most reasonable. I could see the calculation in it, the admission of feeling disconnected, relatable, the claim of not knowing how to communicate, sympathetic, the careful avoidance of actually admitting fault, self-protective. What struck me most was the word misunderstood. It appeared 3 times in various forms. I'd misunderstood her intentions. I'd misunderstood what she needed. I'd misunderstood the situation. Each use was a subtle redirection of responsibility. If I'd misunderstood, then the problem was my perception, not her actions. It was a linguistic sleight of hand I'd seen before in smaller arguments, but never deployed so thoroughly. I sat with the email for an hour before responding, not because I was crafting my reply, but because I was examining my own reaction. Was I being too harsh? Was I letting pride override reason? Was there truth in her claim that I'd gotten it wrong? I walked through that night again, her casual tone, the prepared bag, the expensive perfume, the assumption I'd be there when she returned. No, I hadn't misunderstood. I'd finally understood clearly. My response was shorter than hers by design. I didn't misunderstand. I just finally listened. I wanted to give her something to sit with the way she'd given me years of reading between lines and decoding silences. Let her figure out what I meant. Let her do the work of understanding for once. The days that followed had a strange quality, suspended, like waiting for test results you already know will confirm what you suspect. I went through motions that felt both mechanical and meaningful. Forwarding documents, changing passwords, small acts of separation that built towards something larger. Each one was a declaration. I am a person separate from this marriage. When she appeared at my brother's door, I understood immediately what was happening. This was her power move, showing up in person because digital communication wasn't getting the results she wanted. Physical presence carries weight that texts and emails don't. It demands engagement. It's harder to ignore someone standing in front of you. But I'd changed in those 3 days. Not drastically, not completely, but enough. Enough to stand in the doorway without inviting her in. Enough to set a time limit before she could settle into a longer conversation. Enough to hold my boundary without apology. 5 minutes, here, not negotiable. She started talking immediately, words tumbling out in a rehearsed sequence that sounded natural, but wasn't. I could hear the preparation in it, the measured pauses, the vulnerable admissions carefully calibrated to generate sympathy without accepting blame. She talked about stress at work, about feeling lost, about needing to reconnect with herself. All reasonable things, all things that could be true and still not excuse what happened. I let her talk, not out of courtesy, but because I wanted to hear where she'd land, what explanation she'd finally settle on. She circled around the actual night, mentioning it only in passing, as if it were incidental to the larger issue of her emotional state. The subtext was clear. This was about her journey, her needs, her struggle. I was scenery in her story. When she paused, probably expecting me to jump in with reassurance or questions, I asked the only thing that mattered. Did you expect me to still be there in the morning? The question landed like a stone in still water. I watched her face process it, watched her realize there was no good answer.
If she said no, she'd be admitting she'd intended to end things. If she said yes, she'd be admitting she'd taken me for granted. She chose honesty, probably because she calculated that anything else would make things worse. "Yes," she said, "of course." And there it was, the assumption that had underwritten our entire relationship, finally spoken aloud. Of course I'd be there. Where else would I go? What else would I do? I was a constant like furniture or gravity, reliable, unchanging, waiting. "I wasn't," I said. "That's the difference." I watched understanding move across her features, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. She was starting to realize that this wasn't a negotiation. There was no amount of explanation that would reset us to our previous positions. The board had changed. When I told her I'd left because staying would mean teaching myself to accept less, I saw her flinch. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around her eyes. She reached for my arm, an instinctive gesture, trying to reestablish physical connection, to make this feel intimate rather than formal. I stepped back. Just enough. Just far enough to make it clear that space was no longer something only she got to request. Her question about divorce came with a tremor in her voice. Real fear, finally. Not fear of losing me necessarily, but fear of consequences she hadn't anticipated. She'd wanted space on her terms, with the safety net of my presence unchanged. Now she was facing actual loss, and it didn't look the way she'd imagined. "I'm thinking clearly for the first time in a long while," I told her. It was the truest thing I'd said in months. Her response, "That scares me," was equally true. My clarity meant her control was gone. When someone stops being predictable, stops being manageable, stops being grateful for crumbs of attention, it's terrifying for the person who's been benefiting from those patterns. After she left, I closed the door with a gentleness that surprised me. No slam, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet click and the knowledge that something had definitively ended. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the doorknob, waiting to feel regret or doubt. Neither came. Instead, there was just stillness, deep and complete. That week between her visit and any official action felt suspended outside normal time. I moved into a short-term rental, a furnished apartment with bland walls and generic fixtures. It was perfect precisely because it was impersonal. No memories embedded in the walls, no arguments echoed in the corners, just neutral space where I could figure out who I was without the weight of who we'd been. Her messages continued, but changed in character. The urgency drained out of them, replaced by something more calculated. She was trying different approaches, reminders of good times, mentions of shared friends, questions about practical matters that didn't really need asking. Each one was a probe, testing for weak points in my resolve. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing to say that wouldn't restart a conversation I'd already finished. I told my job I needed personal time. My boss, a woman in her 50s who'd been through 2 divorces, simply nodded and said, "Take care of yourself." No questions, no prying, just acknowledgement that sometimes life requires stepping back. I spent those days doing mundane things, updating accounts, organizing documents, separating our shared digital life into individual pieces. Each task was small but significant, like pulling threads from a tapestry until the pattern disappeared. Friends reached out, having heard something through the network that connects married couples in invisible ways. Their reactions varied. Some wanted details I wasn't ready to share. Some offered generic sympathy that felt hollow. A few, the ones who really knew us, simply said they understood and left space for me to reach out when ready. Those were the ones I'd keep. One night, I cooked a meal for myself. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and vegetables, but I took my time with it, set the table, sat down without my phone, ate slowly. It struck me how long it had been since I'd done something so simple without it feeling like a prelude to disappointment. No waiting for her to come home, no eating alone while she worked late, no pretending everything was fine over silent dinners. Just me, eating food I'd made, in peace. Sleep came easily those nights. I'd expected insomnia, the kind that comes with major life changes and uncertainty about the future. Instead, I slept deeply, completely, waking refreshed in ways I'd forgotten were possible. My body understood what my mind was still processing. I was finally safe to rest. By the end of that week, I'd forwarded all the documents I needed to the lawyer. Bank statements, property information, the marriage certificate I'd dug out of a drawer where it had lived untouched for years. Looking at it, our signatures, the date, the official seal, felt like examining an artifact from someone else's life. Had I really been that person? Had she? Had we ever actually been what we'd promised to become?
The day I went back to collect my remaining things, I chose a Tuesday afternoon. She'd be at work, the house would be empty. I could move through it like a ghost, taking what was mine and leaving without confrontation or ceremony. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the front door, the windows, the small garden we'd talked about expanding but never did. It looked smaller than I remembered, less significant. Inside, everything was exactly where it should be and completely wrong at the same time. The furniture we'd chosen together, the paint colors we'd debated, the accumulated debris of 12 years, books, photos, kitchen gadgets we'd received as wedding gifts and never used. It all felt like a museum exhibit, how people used to live 2014 to 2026. I walked through each room systematically. Bedroom first. I took clothes I'd left behind, a few books from my nightstand, the watch box my father had given me. Her side of the closet was fuller than before. She'd spread into my space already, filling the gaps I'd left. That should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it just felt like confirmation. I was already being replaced, not by a person, but by her expanded sense of territory. The bathroom yielded toiletries, a razor, the cologne I wore on important occasions. The medicine cabinet had been reorganized, my allergy medication moved to the back, her skincare products now dominating the front shelves. More evidence of my diminishing footprint. I took what I needed and left the rest. In the living room, I paused at the bookshelf. Our books had always been mixed together, his and hers indistinguishable. Now I had to decide what was actually mine, what was hers, what we'd bought together and who got to keep shared things. I took books I'd owned before we met, and a few I'd bought during the marriage that felt particularly mine. Left the rest. They were just objects. I could buy new ones. The kitchen was harder. We'd cooked together in the early years, back when cooking together meant flirting and laughing and stealing tastes from each other's spoons. Now the kitchen just looked like a room where meals got prepared. I took a chef's knife I'd bought myself, a coffee mug that had been a birthday gift from a friend, nothing else. Let her have the matching dishes, the wine glasses, the expensive pots we'd registered for. In the spare room, my former office before it became storage, I found boxes I'd packed years ago and never unpacked. Memorabilia from college, old journals, photographs from before her. I took all of it. These were pieces of myself I'd boxed away when I became half of a couple. Time to unpack them. On my way out, I stopped in the kitchen one last time. The keys I'd left on the table were gone. She'd moved them, maybe thrown them away, maybe kept them. I'd never know. It didn't matter. I looked around once more, not nostalgically, just thoroughly, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. I hadn't. Everything that mattered, I was already carrying. I locked the door behind me and slipped my house key under the mat. Let her find it there, a small symbol that I'd closed this chapter cleanly. No drama, no theft, no destruction. Just a man taking what was his and leaving what wasn't. Walking to my car, I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me that needed one more glance. 2 days after collecting my things, I filed for divorce. The lawyer had prepared everything. I just had to sign. My signature looked strange on the documents, shaky in a way my handwriting usually isn't. Not because I wasn't certain, but because making something official carries weight that thinking about it doesn't. This was real now. Documented. Irreversible in practical terms, even if legally it would take months to finalize. I didn't feel triumphant signing those papers.
I didn't feel vindicated or righteous or any of the emotions I'd imagined might accompany this moment. Instead, I felt aligned, like my external reality was finally matching my internal truth. For years, I'd been living in the gap between who I was and what my life looked like. Now, that gap was closing. She called that night. I knew she would. The court would notify her, or maybe she'd been checking, expecting this. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to maintain the boundary of silence I'd built. But another part, the part that had been married to her for 8 years, knew that some conversations have to happen, whether you want them to or not. Her voice was steadier than I expected, more controlled. She'd had time to prepare, to organize her thoughts, to decide on her approach. "I can't believe you're really doing this," she said. Not angry, just factual, like stating the weather. "That one night ended everything." I let the silence sit between us for a moment before responding. "They do," I said, "when both people are still in the room." I could hear her breathing on the other end, processing. "We haven't been in the same room for a long time," I continued. "That night just made it obvious." She went quiet again, and in that silence I could almost hear her reframing, reconsidering, trying to find an argument that would land. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Smaller, more uncertain. "Was there someone else?" The question didn't surprise me. It's the first place people go when trying to understand why someone leaves. There must be another person, another option, something that pulled you away. The idea that you might just choose yourself, choose peace, choose absence over presence, that's harder to comprehend. "No," I said. "That's why I left." I could hear her confusion in the pause that followed. "If there had been someone else," I explained, "it would have been about choosing between two people. This was about choosing between your version of me and who I actually am." I don't know if she understood that. Maybe she did. Maybe she sat with it after we hung up and it eventually made sense. Or maybe it just sounded like more words, more explanations, more of me being difficult when she wanted me to be simple. Either way, it was the truth, and I'd spent enough years modulating my truth to make her comfortable. She said people work through worse. She said 12 years should mean something. She said a lot of things that were technically true and completely beside the point. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I just listened, and when she was done, I told her I hoped she found whatever she was looking for that night. "What about what we had?" she asked. "What we had," I said, "ended when you packed that bag." We talked for a few more minutes, but nothing of substance was said. Just the slow winding down of a conversation neither of us knew how to end. Finally, I told her I needed to go. She didn't fight it. We hung up without saying goodbye.
The divorce itself was bureaucratic and undramatic. Paperwork, emails between lawyers, division of assets that felt more like inventory than the dissolution of a life together. We had no children, which simplified things legally and complicated them emotionally. No shared custody schedules, no forced ongoing contact, just a clean break. Or as clean as any break can be after 12 years. She didn't contest it. I half expected her to, expected some last-minute attempt to delay or negotiate or demand explanations I hadn't given. But she signed the papers when they arrived, hired her own lawyer, and engaged with the process efficiently. Maybe she'd accepted it. Maybe she was just ready to move on. Maybe she'd never been as invested as I'd thought. I'd never know, and I was learning to be okay with not knowing. Friends reacted in predictable patterns. The mutual friends mostly disappeared, unable or unwilling to navigate the awkwardness of choosing sides. A few reached out to me privately, admitting they'd wondered how long I'd last, that they'd seen what I'd refused to see. Those conversations were both validating and painful. Validating because they confirmed I wasn't crazy. Painful because if it had been obvious to them, how had I missed it for so long? My college friends rallied without judgment. They took me out for drinks, let me talk when I needed to, and sat in silence when I didn't. One of them, divorced himself, told me the hardest part would be relearning how to be alone without being lonely. He was right, though I wouldn't fully understand that for months. Family was complicated. My parents had loved her, or loved the idea of me settled and married. My mother cried when I told her, not for me, but for the grandchildren she'd imagined and now wouldn't have.
My father just nodded, shook my hand, and said, "You know your own mind." That meant more than sympathy would have. Her family I never heard from, which told me everything about whose side they believed and how much they'd valued our relationship independent of her. I'd spent holidays with them, brought gifts, learned their stories, but I'd always been an appendage to their daughter, never quite a person in my own right. Their silence confirmed it. Months passed in a strange blur of normalcy and newness. I rented an apartment with too much light and not enough furniture, deliberately sparse. I wanted space that felt open, uncluttered by the weight of what had been. I bought a new bed, new sheets, new towels. Not because the old ones were tied to memories particularly, but because starting over deserved new things. I learned to cook for one without feeling like I was preparing half a meal. I learned to make decisions, what to eat, what to watch, where to go, without consulting anyone or considering anyone else's preferences. It sounds simple, but after years of being part of a unit, individual choice feels both liberating and overwhelming. Some nights I'd stand in front of the open refrigerator for minutes, paralyzed by the freedom to choose anything, not limited by her preferences or dietary restrictions. I slept deeply and dreamlessly. My body, unburdened by constant low-level anxiety, finally relaxed fully. I woke up feeling rested instead of bracing for the day. Small thing, massive difference. While unpacking boxes I'd been avoiding, I found that old card she'd written early in our marriage, the one about forever and choosing each other daily. I read it once, felt the distance between who we'd been and who we became, then put it back in the box and taped it shut. Some things don't need to be processed, just archived.
The last time we spoke was brief and entirely unexpected. I'd assumed our final conversation had already happened. The phone call after I filed, maybe, or the 5 minutes in my brother's doorway. But 3 months after the divorce was finalized, she called. I saw her name on the screen and hesitated before answering. Old habits, old muscle memory of being available when she needed something. "Hello?" I said, neutral, giving nothing. "Hi," she said, and I could hear something different in her voice. Not the controlled tightness or the careful calculation, just tiredness. "I know I probably shouldn't call," she continued, "but I wanted to ask you something." I waited. I'd learned the value of silence, of not filling gaps just to make others comfortable. "Do you ever think about coming back?" she asked. The question landed without the weight I'd expected. A year ago, even 6 months ago, it might have stirred something. Doubt, curiosity, the pull of familiar patterns. Now it just felt like a question I'd already answered. "I think about the version of myself I'd almost lost," I said. Not cruel, just honest. She was quiet for a long moment. "I wish I'd known how serious you were," she finally said. That almost made me laugh, not from humor, but from the absurdity of it. How serious I was, as if seriousness was something I'd hidden, as if I hadn't been entirely present and committed for 12 years. "I was always serious," I told her. "I just stopped explaining myself." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her breathing, could almost hear her trying to find words that would change something, fix something, rewind something that was already long over. "I think I understand now," she said, "what you meant about choosing between me and yourself." "I'm glad," I said, and meant it, not for her sake particularly, but because understanding, even late, is better than nothing. "Are you happy?" she asked, and this question landed differently. Not manipulative, not strategic, just genuine curiosity. "I'm learning to be. Some days are better than others, but I'm learning." "I should let you go," she said. "Yeah," I agreed. There was nothing left to say, no closure scene that would tie everything neatly. Just two people who'd been married acknowledging that they weren't anymore. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," I replied. And that was it. The call ended. No declarations, no dramatic revelations, just a quiet end to something that had ended long before. After we hung up,
I sat by the window in my apartment and watched the city move below. People walking dogs, cars stopping at lights, someone across the street carrying groceries. Ordinary life, mundane and beautiful in its ordinariness. She had asked for one night of space, of freedom, of whatever she'd been seeking. I'd given her something different, a morning without me, and then another morning, and another, until the mornings became a life. Not out of spite or revenge, but out of simple recognition that I deserved to be more than someone's safe backup plan, more than the person who'd always be there, waiting, accepting, accommodating. The apartment was quiet around me, but it wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, of choices I got to make, of a future I was building intentionally rather than defaulting into. I'd lost a marriage, but I'd found something more valuable. The willingness to choose myself, to honor my own worth, to walk away from situations that required me to be less than whole. That night, I slept peacefully, dreaming of nothing in particular, just resting in the knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be.
A year later, I woke up in the same apartment, still sparse, still filled with light. The bed was still too big for one person, but I'd stopped seeing that as a problem. Some mornings I stretched out completely, diagonal across the mattress. Other mornings I stayed on my side, leaving space not for anyone else, but because I could. I'd learned things about myself in that year. I learned I liked cooking breakfast on weekends, taking time with eggs and coffee and toast, reading while I ate. I learned I could go entire days without speaking to anyone and feel content rather than lonely. I learned the difference between solitude and isolation. One is chosen, the other is inflicted. I learned that being single after being married isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about discovering who you've become despite everything. Dating happened, tentatively at first, then with more confidence, not because I was looking to replace what I'd lost, but because I was ready to see what else was possible. Some connections fizzled quickly. Others lasted a few months before running their natural course. None of them felt like failure. They felt like learning, like practice, like becoming fluent in a language I'd forgotten I knew, the language of my own preferences and boundaries and non-negotiable needs. I ran into her once, at a coffee shop we used to go to together. She was with someone, a man about our age, laughing at something he'd said. I felt nothing but mild curiosity. Who was he? Was she happy? Had she learned anything, changed anything? Or was she repeating the same patterns with a different person? I'd never know, and that was fine. Her life was no longer my concern, and the freedom in that realization was profound. She saw me before I could leave. Our eyes met across the room, and for a second we were both frozen. Two people sharing history, but no present. She nodded, I nodded back. No words, no approaching each other, just acknowledgement and then moving on. As I walked out, I realized I felt relief. Not that the encounter was over, but that it had been so completely neutral. No lingering attachment, no buried resentment, just two people who used to know each other and didn't anymore. Work improved. Without the constant background stress of a failing marriage, I had energy for projects I'd been avoiding. I got a promotion I'd been too tired to pursue before, started mentoring younger colleagues, rediscovered ambition that had been buried under years of managing someone else's moods and needs. My boss, the one who'd given me time off without questions, pulled me aside one day and said, "Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it. You're different, better." I reconnected with hobbies I'd abandoned, running, photography, reading fiction instead of just self-help books about fixing relationships. I traveled alone to places we'd talked about going together, but never did, saw them through my eyes only, made decisions based solely on what I wanted to see and do, took photos that no one would care about but me, ate at restaurants without checking if she'd like the menu. Friends told me I seemed lighter, more present, more myself. I didn't disagree. The version of me that had existed in that marriage, the one constantly accommodating, explaining, shrinking, was real, but it had also been constrained. Now I was learning my full dimensions again, testing boundaries I'd forgotten I had the right to set.
She had asked for one night, just one night of space, of freedom, of whatever she'd been seeking in that casual request that changed everything. I'd given her a morning without me, and then a lifetime of mornings. Not because I was punishing her, but because I'd finally learned a lesson it took me 12 years and one dismissive sentence to understand. I deserved to be someone's clear choice, not their convenient backup plan. I deserved mornings where I woke up certain of my worth, rather than grateful for scraps of attention. The apartment stayed sparse by design. Minimal furniture, lots of empty space, room to breathe and think and be. Every few months, someone would ask if I was planning to decorate more, make it feel more lived in. I'd smile and say, maybe eventually. But the truth was, I liked it this way. Open, uncluttered, free of the weight of accumulated compromises and silent resentments. This space was mine, entirely mine, and its emptiness felt less like lack and more like possibility. She said, it's just one night. I decided not to be there in the morning. Best decision I ever made.